Now, the question now is, will Hamas fight? If they choose to fight, most of them will die, because that's the way the Israelis are now going to take this. They won't. I mean, the Israelis are not in the mood to take many prisoners, so they will die. And the Hamas, if they're choosing that, then they're saying to themselves, this is the apocalyptic battle, which will start a process. It will bring in Hezbollah, bring in Iran, it'll bring in Syria, it'll bring in fighters from Yemen, and this was the battle to erase Israel. This will be the begin. This is what they may say to themselves. This is the beginning of erasing Israel from the map. They may say that, or they may say this is spinning out of control from our point of view. We don't want to be destroyed. We'll disappear through the tunnels into Sinai and sit it out for a couple of months. And then when the Israelis are in control of Gaza and struggling with guerrilla warfare that's spontaneous, we'll then come back and reconstitute ourselves. The rhetoric has certainly been pretty high coming out of the Israeli government. I mean, quite ferocious in a way. I'm certain it will be ground, air and sea. I think that's a militarily logical deduction. How relentless it will be partly depends on the amount of pressure that Israel comes under from the rest of the world when it begins. But Netanyahu and his immediate war cabinet obviously intended to be relentless, and they'll want it to be as quick as possible. I was saying this time last week, I guess, that when this offensive begins, it will be multi-pronged. So it'll be, I guess, along quite a lot of the land frontier, maybe all of the land frontier of Gaza. It'll be from the sea. And it'll be accompanied by an even more ferocious air battle or air attack. There's no battle there. The Hamas have got nothing against aircraft, really, effectively. And so it'll be a lot of artillery, a lot of air power. And what the Israelis, I think, will try to do is to compartmentalize Gaza into areas so they can deal with each area in turn, or as it were, seal the areas off so that they deal with them internally. And to do that, it'll have to be a multi-pronged attack. So I think they'll hit Gaza in the next few hours with special force operations. They've already started that, and then with a big ground and seaborne attack that will look pretty devastating if you're there on the ground and if you're a civilian.
So you think it's as imminent as the next few hours, Michael?
Well, I did think it would be overnight tonight, or overnight last night. I was a bit surprised early on this morning not to hear that it had started. And I guess there are maybe two reasons for that. One is I think the Americans are putting a lot of pressure on Jerusalem just to hold back, to give some time for civilians to try to sort themselves out, and maybe to negotiate a humanitarian aid corridor from Rafah, from Egypt and Sinai in the south, although that may now be a bit of a long shot. But also, I mean, the Israelis will want to get everything in place, but they're so well prepared for these sorts of things in general that I think they could have got them in place by probably yesterday. So I thought it might be overnight last night. I don't think it'll be many hours away now, or the Israeli government wouldn't be making these statements. I don't think it's 3 days away or anything like that, unless something happens in the meantime to intervene, some huge diplomatic pressure on the Israelis to hold back. But they're in no mood to hold back at the moment.
I was struck by another bit of your analysis from the last couple of days as well, Michael, which is around, I suppose, a trap is how you describe it, that Hamas may have set here, which would basically be to entice Israel into street-by-street fighting in Gaza, which I suppose would fuel anti-Israel sentiment, because that sort of conflict, sort of by its very nature, will involve the killing of innocent people who have not been able to escape and difficulties around that. Just explain a bit more about, I suppose, why Israel may be susceptible to this sort of trap. Is it falling for it?
Yeah, they always say that you shouldn't do what your enemy wants you to do. And just like Osama bin Laden in 9/11, you know, the Americans did exactly what Osama would have wanted them to do. I often said that if we could have found Osama before he was discovered in Abbottabad and attacked and killed, if we could have found him and said, "How's it all going, Osama?" he'd have said, "It's going remarkably well. You know, I've pulled the Americans into 2 wars, both of my choosing." And I think Hamas may be thinking the same. I think there's lots of other things here. One is that Hamas may be suffering from catastrophic success, that they may have, as it were, they may have been surprised at how easy it was to cross the border. And whereas they expected to be fighting along some border posts and making their point and upsetting the Israelis, they found that they were deep inside Israel, up to 20 miles, and committing massacres that they hadn't quite anticipated. And the whole thing went out of control. That's a possibility. And that they've set off something that they didn't fully understand the implications of. That's possible. The other explanation is they knew exactly what they were doing. and they'll have prepared for this. Now, the question now is, will Hamas fight? If they choose to fight, most of them will die, because that's the way the Israelis are now going to take this. They won't. I mean, the Israelis are not in the mood to take many prisoners, so they will die. And the Hamas, if they're choosing that, then they're saying to themselves, this is the apocalyptic battle, which will start a process. It will bring in Hezbollah, bring in Iran, it'll bring in Syria, it'll bring in fighters from Yemen, and this is the battle to erase Israel. This will be the begin. This is what they may say to themselves. This is the beginning of erasing Israel from the map. They may say that, or they may say this is spinning out of control from our point of view. We don't want to be destroyed. We'll disappear through the tunnels into Sinai and sit it out for a couple of months. And then when the Israelis are in control of Gaza and struggling with guerrilla warfare that's spontaneous, we'll then come back and reconstitute ourselves. I don't know which of those explanations is more accurate, but we'll know within about a couple of weeks.
Gosh, it is fascinating to consider. I wonder as well, just in terms of the region, the potential for escalation. And I'm going to add into this news today that the US is sending a second aircraft carrier to the region to, quote, deter hostile actions against Israel.
Yeah.
I'm just quite intrigued, I suppose, Michael, by the number of, well, there's UK vessels on the way as well to help with humanitarian efforts, but this second aircraft carrier, I'm intrigued, I suppose, by how many nations may become bystanders if they are in the region by virtue of that is just where they are geographically, or they have gone to the region in the case of the US and the UK. A full-blown conflict erupts, and actually then what happens with all of these people kind of in the mix, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, normally these crises are, particularly in the Middle East, are normally accompanied by a certain amount of naval congestion in the Eastern Mediterranean, which I think is what we'll see. The Americans are sending the Eisenhower to join the Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is the biggest carrier in the world, and the Eisenhower is not much smaller. It's on its way. And those two carrier battle groups, I mean, you can start a war with two carrier battle groups like that. And they're there for two reasons. One is because carriers and the whole battle group is extremely useful in lots of other ways. It's a mobile hospital. It's a humanitarian aid distribution center. It's a command post. It's an intelligence gathering unit. There's lots of things that carrier battle groups do because they're so big and they've got so much capability on board. It's like having a little piece of sovereign America, drifting off the coast of Israel and Gaza. The reason that the Brits are there and the French and so on is a bit different. I mean, the Americans are there partly to be useful because they may have to do something in terms of their own nationals, but also as a deterrent to let the leadership in Iran know that the Americans are not going to be indifferent to this and to give themselves lots of options if something does happen. The Brits are there. We've got the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Craft, the Argus and the Lyme Bay. And those are very useful ships. They're not warships, really. They're Navy ships, but they're fleet auxiliary ships. And again, they're just utility ships. They've got helicopters on board. They've got fully staffed operating theatres. They're carrying a company of Royal Marines, 100 or so Royal Marines, who can go ashore if necessary to rescue British nationals who may be stranded. I mean, they may be looking more at Lebanon here. I mean, if the Lebanon front opens as a second front against Israel, then British citizens or Western citizens in Lebanon may find themselves in great danger, and they may need to be rescued. So, the Argus and the Lyme Bay are there to give the British government some options if they have to act quickly on the fringes of this crisis.
And then, so yes, you mentioned some of the other kind of regional actors, I suppose, and which side of this, I suppose, they come down on. Are you seeing, Michael, any indication of a willingness from those other regional actors, Lebanon, Iran as well, Egypt, to become any active part of this? Or is there sort of a lot of symbolic gestures being made with a sort of real noticeable unwillingness and a desire to stay out?
Well, certainly, I mean, Egypt wants to stay out for sure because they will get all the blowback from this. And the one thing the Egyptians really don't want, and this is what the Rafah crossing argument is all about, they don't want Gazans being pushed through the Rafah crossing in high numbers, and a million or even 1.5 million Gazans coming into Egypt to establish, because they'll never go back. they'll never get back. It'll just be like 1948 again. Palestinians pushed out of their territory and they become more refugees for the next 100 years. And so Egypt doesn't want that, and they won't open the Rafah crossing to send any mass exodus of Gazans to create a new Gaza inside Sinai. So they just want to stay out of it, but they'll have to make some statements. Saudi Arabia wants to stay out of it. The Gulf states want to stay out of it unless they can be useful. Qatar is trying to play a pretty useful role because it unique among the Gulf states. It is very much on the side of it's very close to Washington, but it also has inputs into Hamas and Hezbollah and to the Iranians. So Qatar is a pretty key state here. But then you think about Iran. The Iranians may find that although they're thinking about what to do, and they may find that they get pulled in. And the same goes for Hezbollah. Hezbollah in Lebanon, who basically they don't move a muscle unless Tehran tells them. I mean, Hamas are their own bosses by and large, although Iran backs them heavily. But Hezbollah do what they're told. And Hezbollah may find that although they don't want to get involved in this sort of final attempt to erase Israel, the big war that everyone's been waiting for the last 40 odd years, although they don't want that, they may find that if what happens in Gaza in the next couple of weeks pulls them in, that they simply can't stand aside. And the Iranians may find they simply can't stand aside. And then that presents opportunities for Assad in Syria, who's reestablished his credibility with the Arab League, astonishingly. This may be an opportunity for him to get involved. I mean, he'd love to get the Golan Heights back, which is Syrian territory, of course, although, Israel conquered it a long time ago and has been settling it ever since. So he may see this as an opportunity to get the Golan back. And so you've got most actors want this crisis to subside. But Hezbollah may not be able to, Iran may not be able to, Syria may want to take advantage, and then Iraq may play also an ambiguous role.